Welcome to the CanMed Coffee Talk podcast, where we talk with the leading minds in cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, and safety testing. I am your host, Ben Amaralt. I am the Senior Marketing Manager at Medicinal Genomics and proud member of the team that puts on the CanMed Innovation and Investment Summit. All right, well, registration for CanMed 25 is now live. Check out canmedevents.com to see details about next year's event in the new location at the Wyndham Resort in Rio Grande, Puerto Rico. If you check out the ticket packages page, you'll be happy to see that the price for the full summit package is lower than CanMed 24, but that package still includes 3 nights at the resort, full access to 3 days of CanMed presentations, workshops, and networking events, meals and cocktails, and so much more. Now, I know what you're thinking. The event's in June. I have plenty of time. Yes, you do, but it's never too early to purchase your ticket package for CanMed. Not only will you take advantage of early bird pricing, which gets you another $500 off the full summit package, but you'll also get the satisfaction that comes with crossing something off of your to-do list. My guest today is Dr. John Streicher. John is a professor in the Department of Pharmacology in the College of Medicine at the University of Arizona. He has built a long-term research program focused on finding improved treatments for pain. This has encompassed multiple approaches over the years, including testing cannabinoid and non-cannabinoid constituents of cannabis, identifying new ways to target the opioid receptor signaling, and identifying new receptor targets in the body for pain relief. His lab works on both the basic science knowledge of how these systems work and also works to create new drugs for human therapy. During our conversation, we discussed the basics of terpenes, what they are and their role in cannabis, the cannabimimetic effects of terpenes and their synergistic effects with cannabinoids, what levels of terpenes are needed to get a therapeutic effect, a recent study showing terpenes can relieve chronic neuropathic pain, combining terpenes with other drugs such as opioids to get better pain relief at lower doses, and which terpenes provide the best pain relief. Before we get to my conversation with John, I'd like to thank this episode's sponsor, Healer.com. Healer is a trusted physician-developed medicinal cannabis brand founded to address the challenges of helping people and health providers get the best results with safe, reliably dosable products and education on how best to use them. Healer hemp products are available nationwide and include a step-by-step usage guide and response tracker. Healer's distinctive product formulations and education are based on the latest research and work of leading cannabis clinician, Dr. Dustin Sulak. For more information, visit healer.com. Okay, and without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. John Streicher. Good afternoon, John. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks, Ben. Really good to be here. Appreciate the invite.
All right. Well, I'm excited to talk with you today about terpenes. Now, we've talked about terpenes in a couple other previous episodes, how they contribute to cannabis aroma, how they influence a user's experience, even how they're analyzed. But we've yet to really dive into the therapeutic effects of terpenes, at least not as like standalone compounds, which is what I think what makes your recent study and your abstract so interesting. Often terpenes are seen as contributors to the entourage effect with other cannabinoids, but your work suggests that they may have therapeutic effects on their own, which is really interesting. But before we get too deep into that, for those in the audience who perhaps haven't seen those previous episodes on terpenes, could you give us an overview of what they are and what their role is in cannabis?
Yeah, Ben, absolutely. So terpenes themselves are not unique to cannabis. So these are small molecules that are found in essentially all plants, at least all plants that I know about. What makes them kind of unique for cannabis is there's a lot of them in cannabis, more of them than there are tend to be in other plants like hops or pine or whatever. And so what is a terpene? A terpene is a small, simple molecule, like it's small, very aromatic, very small, very hydrophobic slash lipophilic. So small molecule. And we've sort of known about these molecules for many years because, as you just said, they add to the taste and aroma of the plant. And so you have something like, even if you don't know what terpenes are, you kind of still experience them. So you smell that fresh lemony smell from a real lemon, not the stuff that comes in a can. And that's D-limonene, right? That's a terpene. You smell that smell coming off of hops, that's alpha humulene. The pine tree smell, that's beta pinene, and so on. So you've all experienced terpenes, even if you haven't run across that term before. And so, in terms of what they do in cannabis, yes, of course, they add to that unique aroma and flavor. Although, parenthetically, they actually are not what give cannabis that real skunky smell. So we've actually isolated, or we're not the ones that isolated. Our collaborators isolated that compound called prenylthiol, working with it separately. It actually has different activity than either the terpenes or the cannabinoids, but just kind of a side note there. So it's not exactly that skunky smell, but some of the other taste and aroma elements of the plant are from these terpenes. And so, of course, for many years now, people have been looking. We sort of knew that it did this taste and aroma, but people have suspected that these have had therapeutic and pharmacological effects going back some time. And so those have been under active investigation in the literature. And um, and then as also as you suggested, that people have suggested that these terpenes contribute to the entourage effect. The idea that the terpenes might somehow combine with the cannabinoids to give you an effect unique to the plant that you wouldn't get from either one purified alone. And so there were sort of all these ideas floating around. There had been some studies, particularly in pain, suggesting that terpenes could relieve pain. Even clinical studies had shown this, but there were some real limitations in the literature. And there still is no solid evidence whether or not the entourage effect actually occurs in like a cannabis extract that you yourself are taking or smoking or whatever. And so we kind of surveyed this landscape, and about 2020 is when we started our work in this. We said, okay, there's a lot of suggestions, but not a lot of hard data. So let's drill down and figure out what these molecules are actually doing rather than just kind of throwing around ideas. And so we started by isolating the terpenes and studying each one individually rather than, as you say, combine into this kind of this mix or this extract so that we could really figure out what each one does alone before we start looking at them in combination. And so we published that initial work in 2021 showing that the terpenes have what we call a cannabimimetic effect, that they behaviorally they look like a cannabinoid, although they are not a cannabinoid, and their mechanism is a little bit different than a typical cannabinoid. But nonetheless, it produced some of these same effects in animals, like sedation, the kind of the couch lock or couch high that you get, catalepsy, a decrease in body temperature, pain relief, and so on. So it had these effects. And interestingly, in terms of the entourage effect, when we combined the terpene with a cannabinoid, a synthetic cannabinoid, we got a higher impact than either one alone. And that's kind of what got us the most attention in 2021 was this idea that you could combine that that the terpenes were having this effect and that the effect could be greater when you combine them with a cannabinoid. And so that's what really got our journey started in this area.
Excellent. So how do terpenes interact with the human body, particularly in relation to pain?
Yeah, so that is still, really a big unknown question, right? Not completely unknown. So there have been, as I mentioned, clinical studies, other studies showing that the terpenes relieve pain. So even like, say, a study where they would give a linalool to laboring women, like women in labor giving birth, and it showed that they had this benefit. And there are other studies looking at chronic pain patients and so on. Give the terpene, you see this benefit. But there's still, even when you know that, there's still a lot of unknown questions. First of all, like we all know that terpenes have a strong smell, and we also know that humans have a strong placebo effect when they're exposed to what they think is a medication. Like I haven't seen any well-controlled studies that suggest that the terpene effect is separate from the placebo effect. And mechanism is also unknown, right? We don't know how this, if it is relieving pain, how it's relieving pain. And that's something we try to tackle in our own work by, first of all, working with mice who do not kind of have this expectation that a human being does. They don't know. And furthermore, we were injecting the terpenes, so they couldn't get like that aroma or that smell to sort of confound the effect. And then looking at the mice and then also figuring out mechanism and diving in and figuring out exactly what these are interacting with. And at least in mice, we now have data that suggests that these terpenes are stimulating the cannabinoid receptors in your brain. So, sort of the known cannabinoids that are going to be, or sorry, known cannabinoid receptors that are going to be stimulated by drugs like THC and also your endogenous cannabinoids that your own body produces. And we also know that they can bind to and activate a receptor called the adenosine A2A receptor. And again, this is one of those targets all of you know about, even if you've never heard that word before, because that's the same drug, or sorry, the same receptor that's targeted by caffeine. So
Mm,
we've all
right.
stimulated or inhibited our adenosine A2A receptors, whether you know it or not, because we do it through caffeine. And we found that the terpenes stimulate, at least in the mice, this receptor to produce a strong pain relief in a chronic and neuropathic pain.
Interesting. All right, a couple things that you touched on there that I thought was interesting. So the placebo effect. I got to think, especially like you mentioned. I mean, these are aromatic compounds. It would be hard to sort of have a placebo of that compound without it actually being the real thing, right?
Yeah. So there's ways to potentially get around that that I've been thinking about, right? So there's a lot of different ways to take terpenes and indeed cannabis and other extracts. And so if we wanted to take away that part, we might say encapsulate it into a capsule. And so I'm working with a company right now called BlackRock Nutraceuticals that are developing an encapsulated as well as a tincture form of a beta caryophyllene that we're going to be testing in animals and then eventually human beings. And
Now,
that might be one way to get around it.
does that change the bioavailability, whether or not you're inhaling it versus ingesting it?
Yeah, it very well might, but that touches on another problem in the terpene field is that there are very few, if really any, studies that I can find that actually look at the bioavailability and the pharmacokinetics. And part of the reason perhaps for that is that we found it's pretty challenging to do. So we started to do these pharmacokinetic studies. We're having trouble detecting the molecules. You mentioned you had previously discussed how to sort of measure these molecules, and we use gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, but we have a lot of trouble getting it to work consistently. Maybe we're just idiots and not doing it right, but that suggests there could be a reason perhaps why there are so few PK studies on terpenes in the literature.
Okay, and then another thing you mentioned is that, that these terpenes, they're stimulating some of the same receptors that cannabinoids are. Now, is that at similar levels, or are the cannabinoids stimulating more? How does that sort of compare?
Yeah, so pound for pound at equivalent levels of potency, the terpenes are stimulating less. So they're what we would call a partial agonist. So whereas something, actually THC is technically a partial agonist too, but whereas something like anandamide, diacylglycerol, or sorry, not diacylglycerol, 2-AG, those are going to be full agonists. And then I'm trying to think if there's a synthetic cannabinoid that everyone would be familiar with that might be a full agonist. Well, THC is the closest to it, right? So those are going to stimulate at, let's say, 100%. And what we're getting with the terpenes is more like 50 to 60%.
Got it. So you would need higher concentrations of the terpenes to get a similar effect?
Yeah, and that's what we found. So we actually have to use fairly high concentrations, eat both in animal models when we inject, as well as in cell culture models when we're actually looking at how the receptor itself is stimulated by these drugs. And so that leads into another issue, right? When you're evaluating the entourage effect, and we've gotten this criticism in our work, they're like, okay, you had to give a high amount of terpenes to the animals or to the cells in order to see these effects. In an actual extract from real cannabis, the levels of terpene are fairly low, right? So they're not at this high level where you're going to get a high dose. And then like, so how can we have this entourage effect? Well, that even if that's true, to me, it's actually not that important because we can design these drugs or extracts, whatever, we can design them however we want. So we can put in higher levels of terpenes to sort of harness this entourage-like effect or whatever you want to call it in order to help people treat their pain better or whatever they need it for.
Mm. Now, is the criticism more that, evidence for the entourage effect in cannabis itself, that the terpenes are at such a low level, we can't really attribute an effect to them in kind of a natural product?
Yeah, that's the criticism of my work specifically that I've run into. And again, we kind of answer by saying, well, it doesn't really matter. We're looking at what these molecules do on their own.
Yep.
Therapeutically, we can design whatever we want in order to help someone. But so that's the criticism of my work. But then more broadly, there's just a lack of, no, not a total lack, but a general lack of investigation into this phenomena in the scientific literature. So, you can go online and find lots of people who will tell you the entourage effect is real. You get I don't want to name any names, but like you put this terpene in your extract, you're going to get these effects. There's really not a lot or perhaps any evidence for that. And so that's again part of our motivation for doing this work, is to sort of fill in those gaps and put some scientific backing behind the claims that are being made in the public.
Excellent. Okay, so you mentioned that you were doing some studies in mice or rats, or so.
Mice.
Talk a little bit more about that and kind of what's the next stage beyond what you've done so far.
Yeah, absolutely. So I briefly described our initial research published in 2021, showing that the terpenes are sort of cannabinoid-like. And so we were giving those to mice. We had this battery of behavioral tests we give in mice, because you can't just ask a mouse, "Hey, how high are you right now?"
Right.
Like, "You feeling it, bro?" So we have these behavioral tests that we run in the mice that cannabinoids produce sort of these typical behaviors. And so we found that they're cannabinoid-like, et cetera. However, perhaps more impactfully, recently, just a month or two ago, we continued this work, publishing another paper showing the impact of the terpenes on chronic pain. And so not cannabinoid-like, not a sort of a tail flick pain, which is the analgesic assay that we run, that's more like hand on a hot stove pain. So this is trying to get at real patients who are suffering. And in particular, we used a model called chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy. So people that have cancer, they go on these chemotherapy drugs like paclitaxel. Those help the cancer, right? That's great. But many of those patients, even a majority of those patients, get some kind of chronic neuropathic pain, sort of this burning, numb, electric shooting style pain, usually in the hands and the feet. And for some of those patients, it never goes away, even after they stop taking their paclitaxel or whatever their chemotherapy drug is, even after the cancer's gone. And that pain is really difficult to treat. It's not well treated by opioids or other drugs. And so we wanted to, again, test a model that's going to be relevant to real people and their concerns, tested the terpenes in that model, and we found that they were highly effective in relieving this type of neuropathic chronic pain. We got strong pain relief. And since then, this work hasn't been published yet, but we also looked in other pain models too, like a post-surgical pain model, a fibromyalgia-like pain model, and then, an inflammatory pain. So
Yep.
like, strong inflammation. That was the one I wasn't thinking of. And so, 4 different chronic pain models, all of them relevant. Terpenes produce strong pain relief in all of them. And then we have further dug into mechanism. That's published. Anyone can read this if they want. But that's in mice, as you mentioned, right? So this is exciting, but this is in mice. So where do we take it next? Scientifically, we want to further explore turning these into actual drugs. And that's going to go through several paths. One path is going to be scientific, figuring out what is their mechanism, like exactly what they're doing. I mentioned the adenosine A2A receptor, like how are they stimulating that? What does that look like in your spinal cord? What are the neuronal circuits that are being activated to relieve pain? All of that. And then we're also going to do more therapeutic based investigation, because it's not enough that a drug relieves pain to be a good drug. It also has to have tolerable or preferably low or no side effects, right? So if you have a drug that relieves your pain but makes you absolutely miserable, that doesn't do anyone any good. And so we did some of this side effect testing, looking at tolerance and addiction liability, and they have no addiction liability in our hands. In fact, we have some unpublished research suggesting that terpenes can block the addiction liability of opioids. And so that's an exciting future direction that we're pursuing. But we need to look at other side effects, make sure this isn't making the animals and thus you feel miserable, making sure it's not toxic and so on. There's no reason to think it is, but all of that has to be tested. And then on the third sort of pathway is to bring this to the clinic, to real patients. And so here at the University of Arizona, we have very active clinical research programs. And I can work with physicians here that do that type of research to get these terpenes into patients. And as far as terpenes go, we have a big advantage in doing that because it's a natural product. So this isn't some new drug that we whipped up in the lab that we invented that has to go through all this extensive safety, toxicity testing before it can be approved by the Food and Drug Administration. The terpenes are already on the FDA list of what's called generally regarded as safe, GRAS.
Mm-hmm.
And thus we can take these right into the clinic and give them to people without, it still has to be approved by the institution and so on, but we can take them right into people without having to have that approval from the FDA. And that's going to shorten that timeline by a lot. And as I mentioned, there have already been some clinical studies with terpenes. And so we'll be looking at their impact in chronic pain. And as part of that, we also want to make sure that they can be delivered well. So we've already brought up the issue of pharmacokinetics and bioavailability. We're working to also tweak the formulation to make sure that it's going to be stable, that it's going to get into the brain and the spinal cord and do what it needs to do without being broken down.
Hmm. And so now what are you thinking would be the method of ingestion? Would it be oral or inhaled or?
Yeah, so we're exploring all options right now, really. So as I mentioned, we did this injected, but we also have tested oral gavage or just oral delivery, as well as a inhaled version as well, with all with the mice. And interestingly, we found that the oral and the inhaled had less bioavailability. Like even at a high dose, it wasn't producing very much of an effect, just a small effect. And so part of our work needs to be to figure out if this is also a limitation in humans, and if it is a limitation in humans, ways to get around that. So I mentioned we're working with companies, one of them being BlackRock, there's others, to come up with well-formulated terpene drugs that and therapies that will hopefully avoid any of these issues and help people get the relief they need.
Excellent. And now I jotted down the question, but I feel like you kind of answered it when you were kind of explaining how one of the benefits with using terpenes is that they're generally regarded as safe and you don't have to kind of go through that new drug development. So is the goal really to kind of come up with a therapeutic that is just terpenes and not sort of in combination with cannabinoids?
So I think again, there's room to have a lot of different things. So I think there's definitely a space for a pure terpene. Our work suggests that should be beneficial, particularly geraniol and linalool are the ones in our hands that have the lowest side effects and the highest pain relief, capacity. And thus you could make like an extract or a formulated capsule or a tincture that you could do under your tongue, or perhaps a vaporization cartridge. Like all these options are out there, right? But our work suggests that these drugs can be more effective when combined with others. So part of that paper we recently published, we did a low dose of terpene with a low dose of opioid, and we got higher pain relief than either one alone. So the terpene was making the opioid, or perhaps the opioid making the terpene, who knows, more effective in relieving that pain. But when you can give a lower dose of each, you're decreasing the side effects. And
Yeah.
so, decreased potential of that opioid giving you constipation, tolerance, somnolence, where you can't, get to sleep, nausea, and of course, addiction, right? That's the one that everyone's most concerned about. And indeed, as I mentioned, we have data now, unpublished, but still data we're actively working on in the lab, suggesting that terpenes, at least beta caryophyllene, will block that rewarding property of opioid. So I'm envisioning like a combination therapy where you take, say, beta caryophyllene with an opioid of some kind, you're going to get better pain relief, hopefully make it non-addictive, and perhaps decrease some of the other side effects too. And cannabinoid. So that 2021 paper, we combined the terpene with a cannabinoid, terpenes with a cannabinoid, and saw that increased pain relief. So I think there's a place for that too. Our combination studies are sort of still in their infancy. We're mostly focused on the pure terpenes, but that's an area of big development that we're going to be pursuing in the years to come.
Oh, that's exciting. No, and you mentioned that, terpenes have been around for a long time. I know that, the essential oils that you purchase, I mean,
Yeah.
those are terpenes. So why do you think that, they haven't been studied as a therapeutic, really to this point?
Well, they have somewhat, and there are a lot of papers out there. I don't want to short anyone, right, or kind of be insulting. There are a lot of papers out there, but they were still limited, right? So it's like we're going to take a terpene or terpene extract, we're going to give a certain amount to patients, and then we see the pain relief. But for whatever reason, I don't fully understand why those next steps weren't taken. Like, what are the side effects? What's the pharmacokinetics? What's the minimal dose that we need to be effective? And really like formalize and systematize this investigation so you could really turn it into something. Um, I'm just spitballing here. I don't have any evidence for that, but like one of the reasons could be because it's generally regarded as safe. Maybe you can't get a drug company interested in making a product because, they can't patent it. And that's where I've been working. All the companies that I've been working with in this space are all smaller companies, right? That care about cannabis, that care about terpenes. They're not looking to be Pfizer. Maybe that's why they're the ones that are willing to tackle it. And maybe that's why they haven't been tackled in the past with some of the larger, groups. And it could also be the possibility that funding has been harder to come by. I don't really know. So we were able to get funding from this work from a portion of the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, called the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, the NCCIH. So kind of a sub part of the NIH. And they had this program where they were specifically interested in looking at terpenes and minor cannabinoids. And so I will say, just in general, the cannabis field, cannabinoid field, has grown a lot recently. The last 10 or so years, all of that has grown. Funding's become more available. People are becoming more interested. And then some of these minor components or understudied components of the cannabis plant, like terpenes and the minor cannabinoids, those have also been growing very strongly as well with that interest. So maybe the time is just here.
Yeah, well, that's exciting. And now, so as we mentioned too, terpenes, they're not exclusive to cannabis. They are in other plants, and there are other sources for it. I know they can be synthetically derived too. So in the terpenes that you're working with, or even in the vision of what you think the therapeutics will eventually be, will they be derived from cannabis or some other way?
Yeah, I mean, we have some reason to believe that the the chemical diversity of terpenes that you get from cannabis seems to be better than from other plants, right? So other plants will have like a couple of terpenes that are sort of dominant. Cannabis tends to have a lot. Like we've, at least 10 or 15 measurable terpenes in the extracts that we're looking at and working with. But I think a lot of that might come down to the economics and the legal landscape, which I'm interested in, but not, fully an expert in. And so obviously there are companies out there that are, can work with hemp, say, that falls under the 0.3% level for the farm bill and can get these components. But economically, maybe it would make more sense to take it from hops or synthetics. I don't actually know. But I will add to that we mostly work with purified terpenes, but we have done some terpene blend work where we take these extracts that are purified from cannabis, different cultivars of cannabis, and those mixes are also highly effective in relieving pain. That work is not yet published, but we're working on that. And so, maybe there's a specific justification to take the terpene as a blend, as an extract from cannabis. And then lastly, just economically speaking, I think it's generally easier to grow a bunch of plants and extract from plants than to say synthesize all of this in a lab.
Even at the concentrations that you're looking to use?
Well, it's easy to process, like, 100 kilograms, 200 kilograms, 2 tons of plant material versus, that's relative. I don't want to underplay it. Like that's relatively easy to process large amounts of plant material versus having to, get in the lab and synthesize it and figure out the synthetic process. And you have these giant, bioreactors and everything else. And extraction is simpler generally.
Great. So now thinking maybe a little bit more practically, or maybe for folks who are out there who are trying to use cannabis or terpenes to manage their pain, are there certain terpenes or combinations thereof that they could potentially be looking for in products that might be more beneficial based on the work that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to overstate things. All of the work is in mice. We're still got a long ways to go, and I'm not a physician. So I want everyone to keep that in mind when you're kind of evaluating this and potentially considering trying it for yourself. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, all of these terpenes are out there. Like you can get them. They're generally regarded as safe. So it's very unlikely to hurt you to play around with some of these products that are available and see if it helps for you. And in particular, some of the patients that we've worked with through my collaborators, my commercial collaborators, say they get great pain relief that nothing else has worked for. So I don't think there's anything wrong with trying it out. And so it's things to look for. So first of all, there's a lot of companies that say a lot of stuff because this is sort of in the natural product supplement space, really is how most of this gets produced and marketed. And so that means that there's not a lot of like a regulation and work that the company has to do to prove that their products have what they say they have in them. A lot of times they don't really have to do that. But there are companies that are interested in being reliable and doing that work. So try to find those companies, right? If you ask them, how do you evaluate your terpene levels in your products? Like, well, we send it to this lab and they do mass spec. That's a good answer, right? And so if you find someone that validates their work to produce a high quality product, that's the first thing I'd look for. And then in terms of individual terpenes, beta caryophyllene seems to be very common. In our hands, it's certainly good at relieving pain. That's the terpene we found that blocks the opioid reward. Now, I don't recommend anyone start taking opioids on my say so, but that's the one that we suggest could block the opioid reward. And then geraniol and linalool in our hands are also some of the best single product terpenes in terms of relieving pain with low side effects. But there's a ton of them. There's literally hundreds of terpenes, and there are other, at least dozens that are sort of available commercially. You might see like names like eugenol or bisabol. All these products, I can't evaluate them all. So ultimately, at the end of the day, try to find a good product, try it, see if it works for you, and if it does, nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, no, and as you mentioned, there are a lot of terpenes in cannabis, and a lot to be investigated. So a lot of work yet to be done, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
All right. John, before I let you go, I want to give you the opportunity if there's other resources that you think the audience might find useful, if they want to learn more about this topic, or even, if there's links or other papers that you've published, definitely you can mention them here. Send me a link. I'll put them in the show description as well so people can learn more.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have some published work on this. I mentioned I've kind of been describing some of it as I go along. We also have some published work on the minor cannabinoids, which is kind of another interesting area. So, like cannabinol and cannabigerol and some of
Mm.
these other chemicals. So we can publish links to all that. People can read at their leisure. As far as larger resources, there are not yet a lot of those resources available, but we're trying to build them. And so a big announcement went out at the NIH looking for people to establish a national cannabis center that would sort of provide information to the public and be sort of a central clearinghouse for data and knowledge about cannabis, how to research it, how to, give it to prescribe it to patients and so on. That center is not yet in existence, but we got a very good score on our application to do that. And there's a very good chance that you're going to be hearing about this national center in the next year or so. So keep your ears open for that. And then in the meantime, we have a comprehensive center for pain and addiction at the University of Arizona that also provides a lot of resources and links to scientists and clinicians and physicians and public health professionals and so on, all that work in pain, addiction, opioids, and cannabinoids. And we can have all of that available to for all of you to check out.
No, that sounds excellent, and that center that you were talking about, that sounds really exciting and something that's long overdue. So
Long
uh,
overdue.
good luck with that. We hope to see some news on that soon. All right, John. Well, thanks again for sharing this great research that you're doing, and hope to see you down in CanMed next year.
Absolutely. I'm planning on being there. Should be fun.
All right, sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Ben.